Arthur Helm's mansion stood on the edge of town like a tombstone forgotten by time. Its walls, cracked and moss-covered, held a silence as thick as tar that seeped into the lungs and settled there, heavy and sticky. The rain, the endless companion of this place, pounded the roof, its rhythm like the pulse of a dying animal, slow but inexorable. The interior smelled of old wood, candle wax, and something else, subtle, like the breath of the past that refused to go away. Arthur's second-floor study was his sanctuary, but even here the silence seemed alive, whispering in the corners, sliding across the dusty curtains that were never drawn. Arthur Helm, a man of 42, sat behind a massive desk, his fingers long and pale as they turned over the pages of a notebook whose leather cover was worn like an old man's. His face, sharp, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of faded pewter, was a mask of calm. But beneath it there was a crack, barely visible but deep, like a wound that never heals. He was a man of order, of precision, whose movements were measured like a watchmaker's. But there was something broken in his gaze as he stared into space, as if he saw more than he wanted to. Arthur knew that his patients trusted him with their souls, but he never told them that his own soul had been pieced together in a clinic where the mirrors reflected not a face but fear. The office was cramped, despite the high ceilings. The shelves, filled with books on psychology and neurology, smelled of dust, and the patient's chair, upholstered in dark velvet, stood opposite an antique mirror whose frame, darkened by time, seemed too heavy for the glass. The mirror was the heart of the room, its surface murky like the water in an abandoned well, and Arthur avoided looking into it, although he felt it looking at him. He called it a window into the subconscious, but sometimes, in the silence, it seemed to whisper, calling, like the voice he heard in his dreams. The first person that day was Emma Lawson, a 27-year-old girl whose eyes, green as swamp water, were full of shadows. She walked in, her steps hesitant, like someone walking on the edge of a precipice. Emma suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after the accident that had taken her family. Her nightmares were the same, black water filling her lungs, hands pulling her down. Arthur sat her down in a chair, his voice low and soft as silk, and began the ritual. He used his method, immersion, hypnosis mixed with visualization, where the patient had to see their trauma as a picture and enter it. "Imagine a mirror, Emma," he said, his words falling slowly like raindrops. "It shows you the truth." "What? Do you see?" Emma closed her eyes, her breathing becoming ragged. "The water," she whispered. "It's cold. I'm drowning. But there's someone else. In the mirror. He's watching."
Kent. لفي demon أكت كيجاز ألتاتك كهت صالحك كنوا واتفوت أتي منتي أن ييتيتو أكيد خنا أو ريز.
Hands shaking, but she smiled as if something had released her. Arthur did not tell her that her words, "Someone is watching," echoed in his memory like a voice from the past. Next was Henry Clark, a 65-year-old veteran whose wrinkled face was a map of a war he could not forget. His hands, spotted with age, clutched a cane, but his eyes, grey and empty, said more than words. Henry blamed himself for the death of his friend in the war, and his dreams were full of blood and screams. Arthur began the séance, his voice once again, becoming a guide, leading Henry into hypnosis. "There's a mirror in front of you, Henry," he said. "What does it show?" Henry frowned, his voice hoarse as rusty metal. "A field. The grass is burning. He's there. My friend. But he's not dead. He's looking at me." From the mirror, Arthur felt a chill run down his spine, but he continued, guiding Henry toward catharsis. When the session ended, Henry seemed calmer, but his words, "He's watching," lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. The last was Oscar Wilde, a 34-year-old artist whose paintings, full of mirrors and shadows, were like screams frozen on canvas. His suicidal thoughts were nothing new, but his obsession with mirrors made Arthur uneasy. Oscar walked in, his hair black and tangled, falling over his face, his eyes dark as bottomless wells, staring through the walls. "I draw them," he said without waiting for questions. "Mirrors. They speak to me." Arthur began the hypnosis, his voice like a thread leading Oscar into the darkness. "Look in the mirror, Oscar. What do you see?" Oscar froze, his lips trembling. "Myself. But not myself. There's another one. He wants to get out." Arthur finished the session, his hand holding the pen frozen. He didn't show it, but Oscar's words cut him like a blade. He saw the artist off. But there was a feeling in the office that something remained, invisible, but alive. That evening, after the patients had left, Arthur sat in silence, his gaze falling on the mirror. It was still, but a shadow seemed to flicker in its depths. He turned away, chalking it up to fatigue. He checked his phone, noticing a missed call from Emma. He dialed her number, but the answering machine answered coldly. "Subscriber unavailable." Arthur frowned, his fingers tightening on the phone, and a tremor of anxiety, subtle as a crack in the glass, began to form in his chest. He told himself that she was simply avoiding therapy, but somewhere in the back of his mind, the thought stirred that the mirror he loved so much saw more than he did. The mansion was silent, but its silence was a warning. The rain had grown heavier, its patter like fingers scraping against a roof. Arthur closed his notebook, his gaze slid to the mirror again, and for a moment it seemed to stare back. He stood up, turned off the light, and went out, but the shadow in the reflection seemed to remain. Arthur Helm's mansion was damp, its rain-soaked walls alive, as if they were absorbing not only the moisture but the fear that settled in them like dust. Night had fallen upon the city, gray and featureless, where the streetlights were lost in fog and the streets were empty, like veins drained of blood. In Arthur's office, the light from the single lamp flickered, casting long shadows that moved, like fingers reaching for his throat. The mirror opposite his chair was motionless, but its opaque surface seemed to pulse like an eye that never blinked. Arthur sat at his desk, his fingers pale and tense as he leafed through a notebook whose pages were covered with notes on patients whose voices now echoed in his head like echoes from the grave. Emma Lawson had not answered for 3 days. Her phone was silent. Her flat appeared to be empty, and a neighbor, an old woman with eyes like faded coins, said she had seen Emma the night after the session, walking in the rain, her steps like someone calling. Arthur tried to convince himself that this was resistance to therapy, that she had escaped her nightmares, but anxiety was eating away at him like rust. He reread her words, written down during hypnosis. He looks out of the mirror. They were like a splinter he couldn't pull out. In the morning, Henry Clark disappeared. The veteran, with the war marks in his wrinkles, had not turned up for the session, and his house, an old cottage on the edge of town, greeted Arthur with closed shutters and a silence heavier than lead. There was a newspaper on the porch, soaked by the rain, and nothing in the mailbox, as if Henry had never existed. Arthur remembered his voice, hoarse and broken, describing a mirror in which he saw not himself, but a man without a face. The description sank into his mind like a cold needle, triggering a memory, vague as a dream, but frightening. The clinic where he himself had been a patient 20 years before. The mirror in Dr. Livingstone's office, and the voice whispering, "Look deeper." That evening, Oscar Wilde disappeared. The artist whose paintings were like screams left. A note that his girlfriend, trembling with tears, handed to Arthur. I saw what was behind the mirror. It was written in uneven handwriting, the ink smeared as if the hand holding the pen was shaking. Arthur stood in his room, clutching the note. His gaze fell on the mirror, and for a moment it seemed to him that it was breathing, its surface rippling like water into which a stone had been thrown. He turned away, but the feeling of the mirror watching him did not go away. The mansion had become a cage, its silence a threat rather than a refuge. Arthur reread the transcripts of the sessions, his eyes reddened by lack of sleep, catching the words, "Mirror. Someone is watching. He is there." He noticed that each patient in the final phase of hypnosis described the mirror as if it were not just an image, but a door leading to somewhere where they were expected. He tried to remember where this method had come from, the immersion that he considered his own invention. But the memory was like fabric torn to shreds. He saw only fragments. The clinic, Dr. Livingstone, his voice cold and commanding, the mirror that seemed too big for the room. The flashback came like a dark wave. Arthur, 22, lying in a chair, straps pinching his wrists, the lamplight cutting into his eyes. Livingstone, a man with a face like a mask carved from stone, says, "The mirror holds your fear. Enter it." Arthur stares into the mirror, his reflection trembling, as if it were not his but someone else's. He screams, but the sound is lost in the silence, and the mirror seems to grow, consuming him. He had come back from that session a different man, but he had never said who he had become. He had buried the memory like a body in a grave, but now it was emerging, its fingers clinging to his mind. Arthur decided to meet with Rebecca Stewart, a fellow psychiatrist whose practice was as sterile as an operating room. Her office, full of white light and the smell of antiseptic, was the opposite of his mansion. But even here he felt the shadows following him. Rebecca, a woman with sharp cheekbones and a gaze that had seen too much, listened to him, but her questions were like needles piercing his skin. "Are you sure this isn't related to your methods?" she asked, her voice soft but steely. "Hypnosis is a dangerous thing, Arthur, especially one this intense." Arthur lied when he said he had it under control, but his fingers were white on the arm of his chair. He didn't tell her about the mirror, the notes, the dreams he'd had where he stood in a room surrounded by reflections that weren't his. He left, feeling her gaze following him like a flashlight, looking for a fugitive. When he returned to the mansion, he found a drawing pinned to the door of the study. It was Oscar's work, a mirror surrounded by faces, their mouths open in silent screams. The faces were familiar: Emma, Henry, Oscar himself. And in the center, Arthur, but his eyes were empty as glass. He tore the drawing down, his hands shaking, a cold growing in his chest. as if someone had cut out his heart and replaced it with ice. He walked into the study, his gaze falling on the mirror, and for a moment he saw not himself but a shadow, shapeless but alive, moving in the depths of the glass. Arthur sank into a chair, his breathing ragged like a man on the run. He knew he should stop, close the practice, go to the police, but Oscar's words, "I saw what was behind the mirror," were like a hook piercing his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the mirror, what it saw, what it wanted. He took out his tape recorder, his fingers shaking as he played the recording of his own voice, preparing for another session. But now he didn't know who would be the patient, his clients or himself. The mansion was silent, but its silence was like the breath of an animal lurking in the darkness. The rain poured outside the window, its tapping like fingers scraping against glass. The mirror stood still, but its surface seemed to move like water, ready to swallow anyone who dared to look too long. The fog had fallen like a shroud over the city, its white tendrils clinging to rooftops and lampposts, turning the streets into a labyrinth where every turn seemed like a trap. Arthur Helm walked down the deserted alley leading to his mansion, his coat soaked with dampness, clinging to his body, and his breath, escaping from his mouth, dissolved in the cold air. Oscar's drawing, crumpled and hidden in his pocket, burned him like coal, and the words, "I saw what was behind the mirror," sounded in his head like a spell that could not be escaped. He was not sleeping. His eyes, inflamed and covered with a red mesh, saw the world in shades of ash, but his mind was sharp as a blade, balancing on the edge of madness. The disappearances of Emma, Henry, and Oscar were no accident, and Arthur knew that the thread that connected them led to him, to his method, to his mirror, to his past that he had buried but not killed. The mansion greeted him with a creaking door that sounded like a groan from deep within the house. It was dark inside, the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the curtains, drawing patterns on the floor like cracks in the mind. Arthur walked up to the study, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness, as if the house were not a building but a cavity where echoes outlive people. He stopped in front of the mirror, its surface murky as the water of an abandoned pond, but something seemed to move within it. Not a reflection, but a shadow, too alive for glass. He turned away, but the feeling of the mirror watching him clung to him like claws. Arthur decided to become his own patient. He couldn't wait any longer, couldn't ignore the words his patients whispered in hypnosis, couldn't pretend that Oscar's drawing was just a figment of his sick imagination. He took out his tape recorder, his fingers shaking with fatigue as he played the recording of his own voice, the same one he used for immersion. He sat down in the chair usually reserved for patients, his back pressed against the velvet, cold as the skin of a dead man. The candles scattered around the room burned unevenly, their light flickering, creating the illusion that the mirror was moving, breathing, waiting. "Imagine a mirror," his voice began from the recorder, low and powerful, like the whisper of fate. "It shows you the truth. Enter it." Arthur closed his eyes, his breathing deep but ragged, like a man falling into an abyss. The world around him dissolved. The sounds, the creaking of floorboards, the patter of rain, the hum of the wind vanished, and he found himself in another place. The room, endless as a nightmare, was surrounded by mirrors, their surfaces shining but not reflecting light. They absorbed it like black holes. Mirrors were everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling, their edges shimmering like blades ready to cut. Arthur stepped forward, his steps making no sound, but each movement vibrating as if the space knew he was there. In the first mirror, he saw Emma Lawson. She stood knee-deep in black water, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes staring at him, terror in their eyes. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, water gushed from her throat, thick and dark as oil. Arthur reached out, but the glass was cold, impenetrable, and Emma was gone, her image fading like smoke. In the second mirror was Henry Clark, his figure bent as if with guilt, standing in a field where the grass was burning and the sky was bloody. He turned to Arthur, his face featureless, only his eyes, grey and empty, screaming, "You did it!" Arthur turned away, but in the third mirror was Oscar Vane, his hands covered in blood, drawing mirror upon mirror, his lips whispering, "You won't stop." Arthur screamed, but the sound was lost in a silence heavier than lead. He ran, his footsteps echoing in the void, but the mirrors multiplied, their reflections forming a kaleidoscope of pain. In one, he saw himself, young in a clinic, straps squeezing his wrists, and Dr. Livingstone, his face a mask, saying, "The mirror holds everything. Give it your fear." Arthur saw his younger self scream, but the scream was silent, and the mirror seemed to grow, consuming him. He felt his mind being pulled down, as if the mirrors were not just showing him, but taking him, stealing him, locking him away. He snapped out of his trance, his body lurching forward, the recorder falling to the floor, its hum cut off. Arthur fell to his knees, his shirt wet with sweat, his throat tasting iron as if he had swallowed blood. The mirror before him was still, but in its depths, for a split second, a shadow flickered. Not his, not the patient's, but something else. Shapeless, but alive. He crawled back, his hands clutching the velvet of the chair, and Livingstone's voice echoed in his head. "The mirror holds everything." Arthur found an old medical chart tucked away in a drawer, its pages as yellowed as the skin of a dead man. There, among the notes on his treatment, was a reference to Project Mirror, an experiment Livingstone had called consciousness storage. Arthur read, his fingers shaking, a coldness growing in his chest, as if someone had cut out his heart and replaced it with glass. He realized that his method was not his own invention, but an echo of what had been done to him. He had become a conduit, opening a door, but he did not know where it led. The phone rang, its sound cutting through the silence like a knife. It was Rebecca Stewart, her voice tense as a string about to snap. "Arthur, the police have found Emma," she said. "She's alive, but you'd better come to the hospital." "This is weird." Arthur hung up, his gaze falling on the mirror. It was still, but deep within it, something seemed to move. Not a shadow, but a hint of movement, as if someone was waiting, watching, preparing. He stood, his legs shaking, but he knew he couldn't stop. The door he'd opened was still open, and something on the other side wanted out. The hospital on the outskirts of town was a charnel house, its white walls smelling of antiseptic and oblivion, its coldly lit corridors seeming endless, like tunnels in a nightmare. Arthur Helm followed the nurse, whose steps were rhythmic as a metronome, but his own were uneven, like those of a man being led to trial. His coat, still damp from the rain, left behind droplets that disappeared into the sterile cleanliness of the floor. In his pocket was the medical record from Livingston Clinic, its pages yellowed and brittle, like remains he did not want to touch, but could not leave. Rebecca Stewart's call, her voice full of anxiety, still rang in his ears. "Emma is alive, but it's strange. The words were like a hook piercing his mind, and now he could feel the blood seeping from that wound. The room where Emma Lawson lay was cramped, its walls pressing in as if they were trying to suffocate her. Emma lay on the bed, hooked up to machines whose beeping and humming were the only sounds in the room. Her face, pale as a sheet, was still, her eyes closed but trembling as if she were seeing something she couldn't look away from. Arthur stopped by her bed, his breathing ragged and a coldness growing in his chest, as if someone had poured water from an icy lake over him. He looked at her thin wrists covered in bruises, at her hair tangled and damp, as if she had just emerged from the black water she had spoken of in hypnosis. Rebecca stood at the window, her silhouette cut out of the light, sharp as a blade. She turned to Arthur, her eyes dark and sharp, looking through him, as if they were seeing not a person, but his shadow. "They found her in an abandoned house," she said, her voice quiet but steely. "Unconscious, but alive. Brain activity odd. Flickering like she's thinking, seeing, but not here." Arthur clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he felt no pain. He walked over to the monitor, where the EEG traces trembled like threads about to snap. The spikes were irregular, sharp, like screams caught in the silence. He remembered the mirror room, where he had seen Emma drowning in black water, her eyes full of terror looking at him. He knew she wasn't just in a coma. She was there, on the other side, in the place where he had sent her with his method. What did they do to her? He asked, his voice hoarse, like a whisper from the grave. Rebecca shrugged, but her gaze was heavy as lead. "The police say nothing, no signs of violence except for bruises, but..." She paused, her fingers brushing the folder on her desk. "They found this in her hand." Arthur took the object she held out, a pendant, silver, etched with a mirror, its lines thin but sharp as blades. He froze, his blood running cold, as if someone had switched off his heart. He had seen a pendant like that before at Livingstone's clinic, when the mask-faced doctor had given him one like it, calling it the key. Arthur pocketed the pendant, his fingers shaking, and an image flashed in his mind. Livingstone, his voice cold and commanding, saying, "The mirror holds all." He turned back to Emma, his gaze falling on her face, and for a moment he thought he saw her lips move as if she were trying to say something. He took out his portable recorder, the same one he used for hypnosis, and turned on the recording of his voice. He knew it was dangerous, that he was playing with fire, but he had to hear her, had to know where she was. The voice from the recorder began, low and slow, like the current of a river carrying away into the abyss. "Emma, can you hear me?" he said, holding the recorder to her ear. "Where are you? What do you see?" Her eyelids fluttered harder, her fingers tightened as if she were clinging to something. And then she spoke, her voice as weak as a whisper on the wind, but her words cut like glass. "The mirror. It holds. I'm there. He's looking. He wants to get out." Arthur froze, his body tightening as if someone had punched him in the chest. He turned off the recorder, his hands shaking, and there was a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. He looked at Rebecca, but her face was impenetrable, like a mask. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said, "You know what this means." Arthur walked away from the bed, his steps heavy, as if he were carrying the entire mansion on his shoulders. In the hallway, he stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the wall. Its reflection was his, but deep in the glass. For a split second, A shadow flickered. Not Emma's, not Henry's, not Oscar's, but something else, formless but alive. He turned away, his heart pounding like a drum, and in his head he heard Emma's words. He wants to get out. He knew that his method was not just hypnosis, not just visualization. It was a door he had opened without knowing how to close, and now something on the other side knew about him. Arthur returned to the mansion, his thoughts like fragments he could not put back together. He had found an old box hidden in the basement where Livingstone's tapes were kept. There was a tape among them, unlabeled but dated, the year he had been a patient. He knew he had to watch it, but fear was like chains around him. He sat down at his desk, his fingers clutching Emma's pendant. And at that moment, the light in the office flickered, as if someone had turned it off for a moment. The mirror stood in the corner, its surface motionless, but Arthur felt it waiting, watching, preparing. He knew he had to go back to the beginning, to the clinic, to Livingstone, to the mirror that had changed everything. But now he feared that the truth he would find would not be salvation, but the end. The abandoned clinic on the edge of town was like a ship cast adrift on the reefs of time. Its walls, moldy and cracked, whispered of the past, and its wind-smashed windows stared out at the world with empty sockets. Arthur Helm stood before the entrance, his breath puffing out in the cold air, clutching an old cassette tape he had found in the basement of the mansion. Emma's pendant, engraved with a mirror, hung around his neck, its weight an anchor pulling him down. The city was silent behind him, its lights lost in fog, but Arthur felt that he was not alone. Something was following him, invisible but alive, like a shadow that breathes. He knew he had to go in, had to go back to the beginning, to Dr. Livingstone, to the mirror that had changed him, even if it meant the end. Inside, the clinic was a maze of shadows, its corridors smelling damp and metallic, like blood that had long since dried on the floor. Arthur moved slowly, his flashlight picking out fragments of the past, overturned gurneys, yellowed folders, scattered syringes whose needles glittered like the eyes of animals. He found Livingstone's office on the third floor, its door creaking like a warning slanted. Inside, everything was untouched. A chair upholstered in faded leather, a tape recorder covered in dust, and a mirror, an enormous one, with a frame whose swirls resembled veins pulsing beneath the skin. The mirror was the center of the room, its surface cloudy and cold, seeming to await him like a mouth ready to swallow. Arthur put the tape in the recorder, his fingers shaking, but he pressed the button. Livingstone's voice, cold and commanding as the voice of a god, rang out, filling the room. The mirror holds everything. Enter it. Arthur sat down in the chair, his back pressed against the leather seat, which was as cold as a grave. He looked into the mirror. The reflection was his, but the eyes seemed to belong to someone else, empty as glass, but full of something he did not want to see. He began the hypnosis, repeating Livingstone's words, his voice merging with the recording, like an echo returning from the abyss. The world dissolved, and Arthur found himself in a mirrored room, an endless one, where light was not born, but died, swallowed by glass. Mirrors surrounded him, their edges shining like blades ready to cut. He saw his patients, Emma drowning in black water, her hands reaching out to him but dissolving in the glass. Henry, standing in a field where the grass was burning, his faceless face screaming without a sound. Oscar, painting with blood, his eyes full of madness, looking through Arthur. They were here, trapped, their minds like flies in amber, beating in a glass prison. Arthur stepped toward them, but the mirrors multiplied, their reflections forming a kaleidoscope of pain, and each one showed him, not the victim, but the guide whose hands had opened this door. A new mirror appeared in the center of the room. Larger than the others, its surface like a black lake, ready to swallow. Livingstone stood in it, his face carved from stone, motionless, but his eyes, dark and bottomless, stared straight into Arthur. "You did not heal," he said, his voice like the wind blowing from the grave. "You collected. The mirror is a repository, and you are the key." Arthur felt his mind being pulled down, as if the mirror was not just showing him, but taking him, stealing him, locking him in. He saw himself young in the clinic, straps pinching his wrists, and Livingstone whispering, "Give him your fear." He realized that Project Mirror was not a cure, it was an experiment, where patients' minds, their traumas, their souls were gathered in a mirror space, and Arthur, without knowing it, had become an extension of it. His method, his hypnosis, his immersion, all of it was an echo of Livingstone, whose shadow lived in him, in the mirror, in the pendant that burned his skin. He screamed, his voice like glass shattering in the silence. He lunged at the mirror, his fists pounding the glass, but it would not budge, its surface as hard as steel and soft as flesh. He saw faces, Emma, Henry, Oscar, his own, their eyes accusing, their mouths whispering, "You did this." He knew he could not save them, could not close the door he had opened, but he could destroy it. He grabbed a metal chair, its rusty legs creaking, and with a force born of desperation he slammed it into the mirror. The glass cracked, its shards flying like a scream, and the room seemed to sigh like an animal that had been wounded. Arthur collapsed to the floor, his hands trembling, covered in blood, his ears ringing as if the mirror were still speaking. He looked at the shards, their edges gleaming like blades, but there was no reflection, only emptiness, blacker than night. He did not know if he had freed Emma, Henry, Oscar, or trapped them forever. He did not know if he was the victim, or the executioner, or both. He only knew that the mirror he had shattered was not just glass, it was a part of him, his mind, his soul. He sat in the chair, his eyes empty as broken glass, staring into space. The clinic was silent, its walls seeming to close in, as if they wanted to bury him. A surveillance camera, old and dusty, recorded him, its lens like an eye that never blinked. Arthur did not move, his breath as faint as a whisper. But in the corner of the room, among the shards, something moved. Not a reflection, not a shadow, but a hint of movement, as if someone or something was still watching. And in that silence, where time stood still, Arthur understood. The mind is a mirror that reflects not only you, but also what you are afraid to see. We all hold our traumas, our secrets, our mirrors, and sometimes in trying to heal them, we open doors that are best left closed. He paid for this truth with everything, but he didn't know if it was his salvation or his end. Maybe it didn't matter.